Welcome to the May 31st, 2011 meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority. May we have a roll call, please?
Authority members: Manukian. Here. Friedman. Here. Mincy. Here. Jarian. Here. Grazian.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Chair Quintero.
Here. May we have your report?
Agenda for the May 31, 2011 regular meeting of the Glendale Housing Authority was posted on Thursday, May 26, 2011 on the bulletin board outside City Hall.
What's next?
Next is approval of minutes.
So moved. I believe Mr. Najarian was absent.
I will abstain.
Yeah.
The minutes stand approved as submitted with the abstention. Next, please.
Next is oral communication. Cards were submitted. Discussion is limited to items not part of this agenda. Each speaker is allowed 5 minutes. Members of the Housing Authority may question or respond to a speaker, but there will be no debate or decision. And the matter may be referred to staff through the Executive Director for an investigation and report.
I have two cards. First speaker is Rubik Ovanesian, followed by Herbert Milano.
Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor, members of the Council, staff. My name is Rubik Ovanesian. Today I speak before you as representative of Cranbrook Realty. We've been representing Pat Venture and Urban Pacific and as well as New Horizon disposition of their property, 1251 South Glendale Avenue, 1246 South Maryland, as well as representing Pat Venture as the purchaser. Pat Venture has submitted a proposal. Since then, they've modified it for an affordable housing project. There's been some discussions with Mr. Zovak and Mr. Carrillo in the CDBG and the Housing Department. As brokers, we have produced a bona fide purchaser developer to purchase the property. And given last month's authorities' housing recommendations and maybe a second round coming up a few months down the road, we feel that it is critical that attention be paid to this particular project and this particular property, since there's grant monies from CDBG funds that have been administered to the New Horizons. Looking at the preliminary title report, city's position is in the 5th position, which is not very promising to get paid. Unfortunately, danger of seller declaring bankruptcy or the bank foreclosing on the property further causes critical issues on working with this buyer and this transaction for the property. Unfortunately, we received a copy of a letter that has been sent to you by the seller's attorney outlining some of the concerns and issues. And we're here to say that if the project doesn't go through, there's a danger of city losing the funding, the grant monies, because of either a foreclosure or a bankruptcy issue, since the seller is in a very dire situation. Since then, they've shut their operations, and also grant monies, if the city usually loses the money, CDBG HUD requires them to basically reimburse the funds and like a penalty. So given the budget issues, I would urge that the Council Housing Authority look over the project and sooner than later see if there's any ways to fund the project. The developer has modified the project since last month's proposal for a $2.5 million funding to modify it with a $300,000 grant, and then the following year with a $2.2 million entitled the project, and the following year to develop the project. Again, I urge you to see if you, in any way possible, Council can see to fund the project, and by funding the project, developer has agreed to close the transaction, move forward, and the development, the rest of the funding take place next year. Doing that, the city would be reimbursed with their CDBG funds. Currently, given the liens on the property, city's position is not very promising. Thank you again.
Okay, Herbert Milano.
Good afternoon, Housing Authority Chair Quintero, members of the Housing Authority and staff. My name is Herbert Milano. This morning I attended the Glendale Healthier Community Coalition quarterly meeting. And it coincided with the a report generally produced every 3 years as required by the state of California. I have with me some information on the 2011 Glendale Comprehensive Community Needs Assessment. This particular assessment report is over 300 pages of critical information that I believe the Housing Authority should consider to augment the quality of life indicators report from 2 years ago. I want to explain to you a few or highlight a couple of these measures for your attention. Since 2002, the median family income across the board throughout Glendale has dropped. No zip code has been spared. But to give you an example, in zip code 91208, the median family income dropped by more than $10,000 to $91,000. But in zip code 91205, it is down to $37,000. The GMAC report shows a couple of other important information, that there were 5,600 cases of reported child abuse in the area covered by the Glendale Adventist Medical Center. 20% of those were substantiated. Children with asthma, 79%, an increase of 12% from 3 years ago. Domestic violence calls, 329 reported to the Glendale Police Department. Traffic collisions involving pedestrians, 50%. Overweight adults, 40 to 43%. And the heavily or significantly obese, 6%. It is my opinion that the downward trends that we have found in this particular study have a significant impact on the welfare of communities that are economically distressed, like zip code 91205. And as you recall, I was doing or attempting to do a study on the number of families who have their electricity disconnected or have a 48-hour notice of impending shutoff. So the 91205 coincides with the boundaries of the Mariposa district, which has Brand on the west side, Broadway on the north, and Chevy Chase on the east and south. In this particular area, families in poverty are 20%. Adults without a high school diploma, 23%. The admission to the hospital with mental illnesses like depression, 262 during 2009. What I would like to highlight and suggest to the Housing Authority is that perhaps it would be a good policy to augment these reports on a yearly basis, since these reports only come out every 3 years, so that perhaps they could serve as a guideline for future policy. As you well know, unemployment and reduction in family income have a significant effect and an impact on both on the children, on their education. It has an impact on crime. And I was going to make a suggestion for the City Council. One of them is a suggestion that the Housing Authority and the City Council consider having a health fair to augment the now health fair that is now being produced annually by the various Armenian societies. I think there was the first annual one was conducted last year. But I think it would be a good idea for Glendale to provide a health fair accessible to a lot of these families in this particular zip codes in distress. I'm also suggesting that the Housing Authority and the City Council consider having quarterly job fairs. I think we have an excellent venue for these type of activities at the Adult Recreation Center. I've looked at it. One of the larger community rooms would serve perfectly for that purpose, and it's in close proximity, obviously, to 91205. It is my belief that one of the major roles of a City Council and various different, like the Housing Authority, organizations like the Housing Authority, deserve to take a look at these numbers and see how they impact your direction and the policies that you should put in place in order to relieve the significant strain that these families and these children are facing. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Who publishes these reports? Is it the city, a city staff, or?
This one, I
Follow-
believe, is the coalition, which is not coordinated by the city.
Okay.
Okay, next.
Next on the business agenda is Director of Community Development at 6A regarding Section 8 waiting list overview. At 6A1 is motion to receive and file report and provide direction to staff.
Starbird.
Yes, I go to Joseph Rodarte, Administrative Analyst with the Community Development Department.
Good afternoon, Housing Authority, Chairman Quintero, Mr. Starbird, and city staff. Approximately on April 26th of this year, the Housing Authority requested information regarding the Section 8 waiting list. I'm here to present that, to provide that information to the Housing Authority. This is merely just an informational report. This is not a motion to file report. There's no action that needs to be taken. However, I will be presenting some strategies that we would like some feedback on from the Housing Authority to kind of give us some guidance as to what direction they'd like us to follow. So in the interest of time, if I can just get... just a brief agenda of what I'll be covering. I'll be covering the historical overview of the waiting list to give you an idea as to some of the other waiting lists that have existed prior to the 2001 waiting list. The selection process, how we chose to go with this particular process, including preferences, using a different type of system as to previous waiting lists. Processing and managing the waiting list. What procedures are involved? What effects do they have on the waiting list? Our current status, how many individuals, that type of information. Safeguards, how is the waiting list protected from fraudulent activities, both internally and externally. Public awareness, just to make sure that we get out the correct information to the public and make sure they understand exactly how the waiting list works and to kind of put to rest any misnomers that may be out there. Impediments to the Housing Authority. Why isn't there a lot of movement on the waiting list? Additional Housing Authority efforts and also possible strategies which we would like some feedback on. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The Glendale Housing Authority, fourth largest housing choice voucher program in LA County. I'd also like to mention that as of 2002, when a program which by HUD rates housing authorities, it's called the Section 8 Management Assistance or Assessment Program, the Housing Authority, the City of Glendale, has been rated a top performer. We are federally funded, meaning that we have no other source of income. It's all from federal funds, no state, local, or general funds. Currently, we have a budget authority of 1,592 housing authorized vouchers. That does not mean that we actually utilize the full allotment of those. Currently, we only are able to subsidize 1,536, I think it is. And which leaves a gap of roughly about 56 vouchers that go unused at this current time. We'd have it also administer an additional 1,485 incoming portable families. Now, incoming portables are families that receive their voucher from another housing authority and choose to use and find a rental unit in the city of Glendale. And we had just administer the program on behalf of those families. Currently, a majority of those vouchers come from the city of Los Angeles. A little historical overview. There's not a lot of information that I was able to discover or that staff was able to discover prior to 1988. So we assume that at that particular time the need for housing was able to be met. Individuals were able to submit their applications over the counter, and we were able to pull individuals accordingly. March 1988, we do have records showing that we did pull some individuals, or we created a waiting list, first come, first served basis, went through that waiting list within a year's time. And in June of 1989, we established another waiting list. And this was involved the opening of the waiting list with a one preference only for Glendale residents, and it was on a first come, first served basis. It's a massive undertaking by the Housing Authority and staff at the time because we didn't have an outside third party to conduct the intake and the processing of all the applications. It was only located at 3 places. I think it was Maple Park, the ARC, and, if I'm not mistaken, and Spar Heights. And if the Housing Authority recalls, we actually received some media attention because of the safety concerns that we received over 6,000 applications in a 2-day process, and there was individuals that were not injured, but that it caused a public safety concern as to the point where police were required on some of those sites. The waiting list stayed closed for 11 years, and in 1999, our waiting list from the previous 6,000 dropped to 100 applicants. Realizing the need for affordable housing was at its peak at that particular time, and also that we needed to replenish our waiting list. In 1999, the Housing Authority approved the Section 8 open enrollment plan. And that was to establish a system for processing applications and new preferences that differed from the previous waiting list and how we did business prior to that. The major objectives of the waiting list, as I have stated, is to replenish the pool of applicants. It was already down. It dwindled down to 100 individuals. Minimize the disruption of services to current owners and tenants. We wanted to make sure that what happened in 1989 didn't happen again in 2001. So we wanted to hire an outside third party to make sure that it didn't affect our ability to provide customer service to our owners and tenants that are currently on the program while we were conducting the open enrollment period. We also wanted to promote an open and equitable, convenient application process. We learned from our mistakes, and that was one of the things that we wanted to make it very easy for applicants to receive the application and submit it as well. The open enrollment plan could establish a list of preference points, and those preference points are broken down, the objectives of the waiting list were for the preference point to establish the following: to serve the greatest community need, provide a clear delineation of levels of need, and provide a fair and reasonable system of waiting list management. The preferences that the open enrollment plan and the Housing Authority approved plan did list come with a preference point system and categories. They were broken down into 3 different categories: 12 points, 6 points, and 1 points assigned. There was a total, if you can see some of the 12-point categories: displaced by government action, homeless living shelters including domestic violence, victims of hate crime, retaliation, or witness relocation. We also had a U.S. veterans preference, or veteran or surviving dependent of a deceased veteran. We also went, the 1-point categories were a list of extremely low income, elderly individuals, household with disabled family members, residents who live and work in Glendale, and working families who are unable to work due to age or disability. Cumulative, they had a 47-point total. Was the maximum total points one individual can receive on an application that submitted an application. And those are based upon the information that was listed on the application. So it's basically a self-certification. Now, as I said earlier, the Housing Authority met its obligations through a request for funding proposal, which the Glendale Housing Authority secured a third party to commit to conduct all and handle all intake processing of the applications. It was done through a corporation called Wilden Corporation. They, during a 2-week period in January 2001, we opened the intake process, and they took in, submitted, all applications were submitted via mail, phone, were sent out via phone, and this was conducted or completed through local newspapers, community centers, GTV6, 800 numbers, to make for the convenience factor for the public itself. In total, we received, it says there, we have 12,553 valid applications that were received using this new system. There was actually a total of 12,900 due to duplicate applications and also late postmarkings. That was solidified at 12,553. Of those 8,300, I would guess about 8,300 were residents of Glendale, about 67%, with an annual average income of $11,400. And of those 12,553, 300 were designated as veterans. This selection process on the waiting list includes placement on the waiting list. So how were these individual applications placed on the waiting list? The first part of the process was that it was identified and given a random lottery identification number. This is purely for identification purposes so that individuals' names never had to be used. If an individual called in, they would be able to identify themselves by this number, and also for the lottery that was going to be taking place in February 2001. The second part of the process was how was it assigned to ladies? By a two-step computerized sorting process. And that was assigned, the first part of the process is to assign a random lottery selection order, which served as tiebreakers amongst the bucket groups. And next was to create the bucket groups, which are basically, in essence, the preference points. To better illustrate this, staff has come up with an example. It's a little bit easier to understand when you have it in numerical fashion. So what we did is we came up and explained the first process. The first process is the first column, which identifies the Wilden ID, the ID of the individual, so that you did not have to go ahead and identify the person's name at all. The really important part of the process was columns 2 and 4, which are the lottery selection order and the preference points. So what the system, the computer system did was, within a 1 or 2 second span, assigned all 12,553 applicants a lottery selection number randomly. The second step of the process was to then take column 4, which is where all the preference points were accumulated, and to put those in the largest buckets first to help the most needy families. In this case, it was 47 points. And as you can see, no longer, Mr. Joe was originally 4th place on step 1, but now he's risen to the top of the preference list because of the amount of preference points that he has and because of the lottery selection number that he possesses. Some of the waiting list activities, clients or applicants are required by the Housing Authority and also by HUD to report changes in income and address while they maintain an application on our waiting list. This will in turn affect the waiting list position that they possess. If we can go back to the previous slide. For example, if we take Mr. Thompson, who has 4 preference points and a lottery selection order number of 12, and he came into the office and reported an update and that gave him 2 additional preference points. Well, those 2 additional preference points would then give him the opportunity to go and move into the 6th preference point category in between Mr. Brown and Mr. Franklin. Another activity that the waiting list conducts, or the activities of the waiting list, is the purging of the waiting list. We do this on a monthly basis. It involves 200 mailers being mailed out to individuals on the waiting list, and this is to gauge interest and to ensure that the most current waiting list that we possess the most current waiting list. This is done in a process of mailers, obviously. But we do it and give an opportunity. It doesn't mean that we just remove individuals from the waiting list once we hear 1 response. We send out 2 mailers and a certified receipt to ensure that these addresses, we've tried every avenue that we could. In some cases, when numbers our phone numbers are present on the application, we'll make a phone call to try to see if there's any contact that we can establish with the applicant.
I'm going to have to step off the dais. So I'll let Mr. Najarian, the Vice Chair, continue with the meeting.
While you're stopped, how often do you send that to the waiting list?
We do 200 applicants every month. So it's been a slow process since the very beginning. We're probably about 2/3 through the entire waiting list. So we still have at least another third to go. What procedures are involved in the waiting list? How an applicant proceeds from the waiting list onto the Section 8 program. Each applicant is pulled in what's called a draw from the waiting list, which pulls the highest preference points numbers in accordance with their selection number. Each applicant's preference points are then verified at the time that they're pulled off of that waiting list. It involves a preliminary analysis of it, and that is the individual that sent out the mailers also reviews it and establishes whether they meet the qualifications as far as preference points, and then it moves into the hands of a housing advisor. Individuals that are pulled off of the waiting list that do not meet those preference points or do not meet the criteria are then put back accordingly as far as what the correct number of preference points they did have. And all applicants, I'd like to say, are subject to HUD screening and eligibility policies. This involves income levels, criminal record background screening, and also citizenship status.
They also check to see if they report that they're a veteran, they check on that, or someone checks on that?
If they're a veteran? Yeah, anyone that reports that they're a veteran, we also run to vet that through, usually through a VA rep, and we try to coordinate that so that we get a discharge form, a 214 I think it's called, to make sure that they were honorably just discharged from the service. Current status of our waiting list. Some things that affect our waiting list is the average monthly turnover. We average 5 vouchers per month. This would seem that we would be able to assist 5 additional individuals every month from the waiting list, but that's not so. Unfortunately, due to, as Mr. Zovak presented last week and Ms. Williams, we're trying to meet our funding levels that we have and trying to make sure that the amount of funding we receive from HUD is able to sustain a certain number of vouchers, and we're trying to find whatever that number is. Right now, we're at 1536, and we possibly going down to the low 1500s. Vacancies only occur on the Section 8 program so these voucher turnovers only occur due to tenant termination, family self-sufficiency or voluntary withdrawal, typically, or PHA termination. These are through attrition, so fraud, noncompliance, or death is usually the only way an individual relinquishes a position on the Section 8 program. Currently, our waiting list has 5,768 applicants on the list, and we're serving 5 preference points at this current time. It does not mean that these numbers can't change, because if we pulled individuals off of the list and then we reinstated them to the program, let's say they didn't respond, we're usually very lax about that. We want to make sure we assist, and if they were on the waiting list at one time, we try to make sure that they stay on the list if they still have that interest. Preference points obviously can be adjusted, so that number can be less than 20 right now, but it can jump to as high as the number it needs to when those individuals provide updates to our office. Security of the waiting list. This is a big issue, and we would like to make sure that the public does understand, as well as the Housing Authority understand, that we do have security measures in place that prevent fraudulent activity, both internally and externally. Our internal controls involve the security of our current staff as far as qualifications and so forth. We have 32 housing employees. Only 1 individual has the rights to make changes to this waiting list. It minimizes the opportunity for any individuals to go in there and restricts it. The software system, love technology, so the software system allows us to protect and assign only certain task roles to these individuals, so only there's viewing rights if you assist the public, that if you're an individual that works on the waiting list, then and this would be the sole individual, then you would be given the opportunity to go ahead and change the data, and that being the only person. We also have internal auditing. I supervise the individual that handles the waiting list, and there's also we have an internal department auditor that monitors all her activity. We, through our software system and our IT individuals, able to run reports since we went to this software back in 2005 that allows every single instance or activity that's been entered into that system to be identified. It provides a name, and it also provides the action that was completed. So every action is checked to make sure that not only was the correct action followed up with as far as the update, but that the correct individual handled it and that the correct individual was handling it. We also have, and third or fourth would be that all applications are under lock and key. We have a secure room, if not secure file drawers that restrict access to these files. They are not handled by everyone, and they are required to ask permission to be pulled. We have monitoring in place, and this takes place, this takes place at the level where an individual is pulled off of the waiting list. Because individuals are pulled off a waiting list in what's called a draw, that report is then placed in every individual application that is given to a housing advisor. It goes through 3 levels. The first level would be the individual, the preliminary. The second would be the housing authority, and the third would be the supervisory role. All 3 run a check to make sure the person checks for the preferences and that the application is off of our waiting list, and that everything is copacetic. The randomly assigned case management. There's a random assignment of the case management to minimize who knows which case is going to whom. It minimizes the possibility of an individual knowing anything as far as handling one particular case and trying to direct its path in that process. Some of the misconceptions that may be out there in the public, we just wanted to take this opportunity, and I wanted to thank Council for allowing us to speak, especially on this particular part, would be portables. We've received numerous calls from individuals stating that someone received a Section 8 voucher and that they're being assisted. We are not, and I'd like to state that for the record, we are not issuing any vouchers at this time. Haven't been for a while now. I think within the last 2 years we've issued 19 vouchers. At this particular time we are not issuing. We do have local neighboring housing authorities that may be issuing. The only one I do know of right now is the City of Los Angeles that's issuing. So it could be conceivable that these individuals that are calling and saying that they know of individuals that receiving assistance from the Glendale Housing Authority, there's not much of a difference between us administering the program or us coming off of the waiting list, may be misconstruing this for a Section 8 voucher from Glendale. They look identical, for the exception of it reading Glendale Housing Authority on behalf of whatever housing authority we're administering. No one person can influence placement on the waiting list. Not housing authority members, council members, supervisory staff, senior management. No one can influence any sort of placement on the waiting list. And last, we'd like to make you aware that all fraudulent or all claims that are reported to the housing authority, we have an investigator that does handle these cases and does look into whether it's a claim against an employee, whether it's a claim against a possible individual in the public. Each one is looked into carefully. Some impediments to the waiting list. The instability of federal funding. Last week, we came before the Housing Authority to receive the okay to receive $2 million to meet our fiscal year 2011 or 2010 budget. That was because of not being able to receive information prior to this and do effective planning. HUD is notoriously known for providing the information after the fact and then asking and taking from housing authorities. To make corrections, housing authorities are then become cautious because of this activity and fearful, and us being one of them, we don't want to put the horse before the carriage, or the carriage before the horse, and try to fill up the capacity of vouchers that we have of 1592 when only 1536 is able to what we're able to sustain at this time. Federal actions. We have experienced some recaptures of our net restricted assets over the last 4 years, and that has affected the ability to issue additional vouchers when in turn has not allowed for a lot of movement on the waiting list. Decreases in tenant income results in increases in HAP. A small incremental increase or decrease in a tenant's portion results in an incremental increase in our portion, but across the board. So if you're having individuals that are receiving in-home supportive services and no longer receiving the number of hours, they report it to us. SSI has cut back as well. So those are affecting housing authorities across the country as well. It takes time to take corrective action when implementing strategies. As I had mentioned, housing authorities are very cautious about leasing to full capacity because it takes so long to get back down. The only conceivable way we were able to think of is through attrition, and that's usually the most way that most housing authorities do their business, as far as just letting them drop off and not filling those vacancies. We also have managing shortfalls through attrition. From time to time, housing authority members have mentioned, what can we do to get additional vouchers? How do we market the program better? Those types of things. And this is to highlight some of the additional vouchers that we've tried to go after over the last year and a half. One of them being the non-elderly disabled grant, and we partnered with Lanterman Regional Center for a grant of 100 additional vouchers, requesting over $700,000. Unfortunately, because the number of grantees or qualified grantees for this particular grant, HUD decided to give these grants to housing authorities by random choice. So they randomly selected housing authorities. Unfortunately, Glendale was not one of them. And we also had the Veteran Administrative Supportive Housing Program. The only reason we weren't able to acquire these vouchers is we are a high-performing housing authority, but unfortunately we're not located to a regional center for the VA. Usually these were handed out to housing authorities that were located close to Long Beach Housing Authority. Los Angeles also received some smaller housing authorities. Unfortunately, we're not able to receive any VASH vouchers. We do accept them. We do have a couple individuals that have been able to port their assistance over to the city of Glendale and use that VASH voucher. We also market affordable housing projects to waiting list applicants. When projects that are being developed, they need a qualified waiting list. We scour our waiting list and pull that data to make sure any individuals that qualify for this particular affordable housing project, they're notified and they receive applications if they're interested. A couple of examples would be Casa de la Paloma and Vassar City Lights. This does not mean, though, that we remove them from the waiting list. It just provides a way for them to go ahead and hopefully find an affordable renting option in the meanwhile while there's Section 8 assistance, or while they wait on the Section 8 waiting list. And last, cost-saving strategies. We make sure that we minimize and utilize our voucher payment standards and subsidy standards effectively. Voucher payment standards are based upon fair market rents. The housing authorities are allowed to base our voucher payment standards in turn set them between 90 and 110% of the fair market rent. We set ours currently at 90%. However, whenever HUD publishes their new fair market rents in October of each year, we have to adjust our 90% line. This allows us to assist the most amount of families that we possibly can with the funding that we receive. Which brings me to possible strategies that I'd like to present, or that staff would like to present to the Housing Authority. One possible option to help out with maybe some movement on the waiting list would be to hire a third-party agency, similar to as we did with the opening of the waiting list with Wildan, to purge it all at one time. Mass mailing, they would handle the intake, they would handle the processing of that, and at this the positive of this would be it possibly decrease the number of applicants on the waiting list so that we make sure that we have the most current. The number would drop from the 5,700 that we have probably to obviously a lower number. But it also could possibly cause massive preference movement, which could be disturbing to the public. All of a sudden you're one day and you end up being 150 the next. There's certain, obviously you have to weigh that option. We also have criminal record background checks on all current participants above and beyond HUD requirements. HUD currently if I'm not mistaken, HUD, currently, we're only responsible for doing criminal record background checks at new admissions and also when an individual is added to the household. So, or when we receive some sort of infraction on the program, then we go back and we'll do a criminal record background check with the participant's clearance. Those would be the only times. We would like to do a mass mailing or a mass conduct criminal record background checks all at once or over a certain period, a short period of time. This would free up some budget and possibly some vouchers for eligible applicants. But it also would be trigger, and this is probably, in hindsight, also create a financial burden, possibly, is the number of informal hearings that may be requested by these individuals that were then terminated from the Section 8 program for the violations. We do incur costs for our informal hearings that we provide to the tenant. So that could be that'd be something that the Housing Authority would have to weigh. And last but not least, we asked targeted households to voluntarily withdraw from the waiting list. Individuals that have ported over from other housing authorities, we've been able to identify roughly about 119 families. Those 119 families would then be approached and say, if you'd like to withdraw your name from the waiting list. There's not much of a difference between having a housing voucher from the city of Glendale and also from other housing authority. The only difference being that we administer it. You handle all your business in the city of Glendale. So the only benefit would be the only detriment to it is that you would be sent back to the original public housing authority at the end of any sort of process if you were terminated or removed. That would probably be it. But we would ask those. We also would have identified possibly an additional 60 families, so it brings the total up to 170 families that possibly that spouses have been identified. We haven't really looked into that in great detail, but we would like to at least make it a possibility or part of, a possible strategy for the housing authority to consider. At this time, that concludes the presentation. There's a staff available to go ahead and answer any questions that the Housing Authority may have.
Mr. Manukian?
I saw Vassar Lights. Who is administering the Vassar Lights project? And I sent an email. There was a letter from a community member raising issues regarding Vassar Lights. I sent it to you. I don't know if you received it.
I did receive it, and we're looking into it prior to giving you a response back and then contacting the applicant as well. Okay. Vassar City Lights is an ADI-sponsored affordable housing project. Consists of 2- and 3-bedroom units. It's a tax credit project. Currently, it's being administered, owned, and operated by a combination of entities. It's ADI, as well as ADI's tax credit investor, PNC, that has exercised some rights in taking control of the property.
Okay. And
they've hired a property management firm to manage the property for them.
Have we had any problems with them in terms of tenants and wrongdoings? Put it to you that way.
On the developers?
On the people who are administering the program.
We've had typical...
You had complaints regarding the management company or the owners?
We've
from
had...
tenants or applicants?
Typically in projects of this size, when you're leasing up, there are complaints. Whether they're warranted or not is what staff looks into. Anytime a property management firm is dealing with that number of clients and then trying to qualify them, some they're denying, some they're approving, there are bound to be complaints.
How many units is it?
Vassar City Lights is 72 units, of which 2 units are managers, so 70 units affordable housing units.
How many applicants were there?
There were in excess of 4,000, I believe, that applied for that project.
But that's not necessarily Section 8. You
No,
could
that is-
be a
Right,
Section
right,
8
right.
applicant.
No, and that's why that was not a strategy that
You were
we
really
wanted
lucky.
to.
You get your Section 8 voucher and you win the lottery to get into the project. I mean, that would be extremely fortunate.
In that particular case, you're in a new development. Yes. And that is why we did not offer a strategy of asking applicants to voluntarily withdraw who are living in one of our affordable housing projects and happen to have a Section 8 voucher as well. Because those affordable housing projects, as I mentioned before, are typically tax credit projects. Their rent structure is completely different than Section 8. So if someone were to remove themselves from the Section 8 voucher program, their portion of rent would increase dramatically. It'd still be affordable under the state of California regulations, but it would increase dramatically. So in the suggestion that we have here is asking targeted households to voluntarily withdraw from the program. Those would be, as Mr. Rodarte mentioned, those that currently have Section 8 portable vouchers, have moved into Glendale, and also continue to be on the Section 8 waiting list. For them, voluntarily withdrawing from the Glendale Section 8 waiting list would be no harm, no foul type of activity.
Well, let me ask the question then. With regard to one of the strategies, let's call it purging or culling or updating our waiting list. We can only do that with regard to our vouchers, correct? We can't do anything with regard to the LA City vouchers.
Not the vouchers, the waiting list.
It would just be the waiting list.
Well, I mean those that are on the LA.
Yes, it wouldn't have anything to do with the waiting list with the
So it would just be
authorities.
our list.
The 12,553 original list, we would be doing the purging of that list only.
But we're down to how much on our waiting list?
Right now we have over 5,700 applicants still on the waiting list.
What would the cost be if we were to hire a Willdan type company to go through, update, if they're still alive? I know several. I've heard stories of several people who have died, while waiting for their voucher, or moved, or had income changes, or all these different factors that you verify.
Of course, today we've only presented these possible strategies. We wanted some feedback from the Housing Authority to see which one perhaps you'd like us to pursue. We don't have a cost estimate, though, at this particular time.
Certainly Vice Chair Najarian, certainly the mailing alone would cost around $10,000. We haven't gone out for any services lately, obviously in this case since 2001, but I would be surprised if it was anywhere near a $200,000 PSA or contract to be able to try and purge the waiting list. The bulk of your time would be inputting data as it comes back, follow-up letters that are required to be mailed out, then certified letters, then the cost of those to be mailed out, and after that it's data entry and management.
Sorry, did you say you would estimate 200,000?
I would be surprised if it's any number even close to 200,000, so I think it would be a lower number.
Lower.
How low, I don't know.
And where would those funds come from, assuming there was a figure that we were interested in doing? From whose budget would that?
In this particular case, it would be coming from the Housing Authority's reserve. As we discussed last week, there is
Administrative reserve.
a large Section 8 administrative reserve fund that is out there. HUD has, for the most part, come out and said either use it or possibly lose it. When we were discussing the issue with one HUD representative, they said, your reserves are for a rainy day fund, and guess what? It's pouring outside. So if the authority were to say that the cost of this particular strategy, let's say it comes out to be $150,000, $150,000 to do a massive one-time purging of the waiting list that may result in some movement of the waiting list for individuals is worth a $200,000 investment, especially considering the fact that it's been 10 years since it first opened.
Personally speaking, I would be interested in at least looking at that, getting some cost estimates as to what it would ultimately be in terms of the Willdan. I don't want to say Willdan, but in terms of a third party coming through. There's a lot of frustration on those on the waiting list, a lot of hopelessness that they're feeling, a lot of perhaps misconceptions on those on the list who are not entitled to be on the list due to a change in any one of those priorities that you've enumerated. So I think that might be something good. We may, in fact, find our waiting list to be a lot smaller than currently indicated, and I think it would be good for the community at that point, and perhaps at some point in the future we could discuss reopening the waiting list to get a new group in. Maybe not in my tenure on the Housing Authority, but at some point in the future, just to get some movement and, as I said, give some hope to these people that have been waiting and haven't heard much. Many of them their lives are hanging on waiting for this Section 8 voucher to come in. Mr. Starbury.
To be clear, let's say you're number one on the list, but your income level has changed and you haven't notified us, and you have a voucher now that's available. They're going to be interviewed, and if indeed their income level no longer makes them eligible, they're not going to get a voucher.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah,
The likelihood is you may find somebody who gets to the top of the list, and maybe they could have gotten to the top of the list sooner, because maybe they have more. Maybe they've gone from being 52 to 62, so now they get an extra point for senior. But if it's the other way, you're not going to get on unless you actually meet the requirements.
Exactly.
And the advantage to doing this en masse is that your staff, what your staff would otherwise be doing on a case-by-case basis, you're basically, the help is coming where they can assist you in going through large chunks of
This would be,
applicants on the
yes.
wait.
And that it would be, we're doing it at a 200 mailer right now per month. So this would be one massive mailing, handle all the intake, and then have one clean waiting list within probably a 6-month period.
Human nature is, if your situation's changed and you're a lower priority, not a lot of incentive to inform the agency. If your preferences have changed and it's in your favor, there certainly is. So in all likelihood, you're going to end up shifting a lot of people who maybe are higher on the list that we might be having to call through one by one. You're going to be finding out about that now.
And this is all predicated on there being vouchers to actually be issued. It doesn't mean they're being pulled off of the waiting list. It just means that we're cleaning up the waiting list to make it the most current.
Mr. Mnuchin.
Yes, there's a perception in the community that, and I don't want to blame anyone of anything, that certain people are paying money to get on the Section 8 list. And because our list is kind of moving around, it's a moving target, and it's very difficult to explain the process to the community. There is a perception out there that there's preferential things going on in the waiting list program, in the Section 8 program. So I wanted to suggest that we freeze everyone that's on the waiting list currently. Freeze them where they are in terms of location, where they are on the waiting list. If they're number one, they'll get a thing that says you're next. If they're number 5,768, they get the number 5,768. And from now on, they know that if they're number 100, once number 99 ends, they're next. They'll go in and go to the interview. What would it take to change the plan to include this suggestion? And I don't know if my colleagues would agree with that, but
We actually had this conversation with HUD describing, let's do away with the entire waiting list, let's scratch it, and let's do it. Unfortunately, because of Code of Federal Regulations does not...
Hold on. That's not what's being suggested.
No, that was one of the things that talks that we had, one of those. Another one was actually freezing the waiting list so that it would be in sequential order on that,
Right.
basically a snapshot of time. Where it would be one individual through whatever the remaining applicants would be. HUD's very hesitant to go ahead and give the okay or the nay to the suggestions. However, they said basically proceed carefully and very lightly. They're not going to back a housing authority because of the legal possibilities that can come upon them for that decision that's made by that particular housing authority. So they're not going to give the okay on that. But what they did say is go ahead and consult the Code of Federal Regulations, and they said in this particular instance it would be 98.2204 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which states that no adverse action can be taken against an application mentioning and altering preference points, position, time, or date. So it's all based upon HUD wants to make sure the most fair and efficient manner is being projected to the public. If this action is not justifiable, but is just arbitrarily being asked for, and there's not a strong backing for this, then it could leave the housing authority.
what do you mean by strong backing? I mean, you're just replacing one the preferential points remain. You're replacing one system of awarding the Section 8 vouchers with another method.
It is,
Not
but
even a system.
it's rewarding the individuals, and just saying that it's rewarding the individuals that are at the top of the waiting list
Right.
that do not have an opportunity to move up because the preferences that they would have been able to claim had their situation changed. And
Is the preference points mandated by HUD?
it's
Or
given,
is it our recommendation, our process?
it's in our administrative plan. The HUD gives us
Right. So it's
certain
our
guidelines.
plan, it's not us plan.
Exactly, but
Preferential points.
but the preferences do come out of the Code of Federal Regulations. We just took the codes that they used and suggestions, and we used them into our administrative plan to use as a basis for the particular system that we use in place now.
I
I understand what you're saying, but the problem that I see is, let's say you freeze everyone in this, let's say on June 1st. Your points are your points, and you can be ranked in terms of your lottery number that came through. But what if someone, let's say a year from now, gets a better job, or they move out of Glendale? These are all points that are factors. Of course, you're not going to get any younger. If you're over 62, you're over 62.
No,
if you're disabled,
if someone gets a job and is out of the city, he's out of the list, basically.
no, that's just 1 point.
1 point.
Correct.
That's a
So
residency preference.
if they get a job, let's say they get a higher income job, they're no longer qualified, right?
Well, one of the points, and I don't know the detail, but one is extremely low income. Let's say you get a part-time job somewhere. Instead of extremely low, you're just very low. Correct. That's the next level.
Right.
So what do we do with...
Well, that's the whole point. Everyone freezes, I think, at one point, and you go through the list. And basically, you're doing away with the perception that it's a moving target. And if we can't guess everyone who's going to change their preferential points over the next, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So it's impossible to deal with that.
Of course. If I may, Mr. Manukian.
Let me... Mr. Garbert's been raising...
I mean, maybe there's an opportunity here to marry two interests. When your list gets to be 10 years old, it seems to me you have to anticipate there's going to be changes. You couldn't freeze a list for 10 years and not have changes. It just seems natural you're going to have some rather significant changes in 10 years. People die, people go from 52 to 62, and now they get an extra point just by the fact they've been on the list for 10 years. But maybe for shorter periods of time you could freeze it, in which case anybody who doesn't qualify isn't going to get a voucher. So if their situation has changed, when they're interviewed, they're not going to get a voucher if they don't qualify for the program. But at least for a shorter period of time you could qualify. Now you've got a 10, 11-year-old list. Maybe it's time to update it, make sure everybody on there is where they should be given this current snapshot in time, and then you hold that for 2 years, 3 years. And then in 2 or 3 years, you come back and you assess it, and maybe you think it's time to update it again, or you continue freezing it again. It just seems to me we now go 10 or 11 years before we either open or update a list. That's a long time. I mean, that's a long time. Everybody's situation changes in a decade. So it seems to me there's some justification to freeze, but maybe you should be updating what is currently a 10, 11-year-old list before you end up now freezing everybody in place. And then you look at it more often than we have looked at it. I mean, it's so painful, we only do it every decade, but in a decade, we know everybody's situation changes in the course of 10 years. And the lists, just by their nature, become rather stale, if not extremely stale, in a decade period of time. So maybe you do both. Maybe you look at getting...
update and freeze?
Update and then consider freezing for a period of time. It's going to be for 3 years. A 3-year shot, boom, and we'll come back and we'll assess the list in 3 years.
That seems workable. Is that workable?
Mr. Vice Chair, if I could jump in here. What Joseph gave you was HUD's almost verbatim response, but if you want to read between the lines, what HUD was saying is that you opened and operated your waiting list using preferences, and these preferences exist for the entire time that applicants are on the waiting list. Not just day one at the time that the lottery is closed, but continually. People have the ability to go in there and tell you, I'm now very low income, give me my additional point. I'm now homeless, I'm in a homeless shelter, I want my 12 points. And we were obligated by our administrative plan in the way that waiting list was set up to do that. What HUD is saying, as I said, in between what they're telling us, is that you're opening yourself up for possible legal action by, in midstream, changing the way that the waiting list is operated. They didn't necessarily say you cannot do that, but the feeling that staff received was you open yourself up for quite a bit of legal action, fair housing issues, and those fair housing issues trump any desire maybe to speed up a waiting list process.
If we get pre-approval, can we get pre-approval on a proposed, or is that?
We tried to get pre-approval
doesn't sound
just by talking with them on the telephone, and they wouldn't give it to us.
They wouldn't.
But by midstream, though, that means we have a current list.
Exhausted.
What?
We have a current list, and in most cases, HUD is saying exhaust your list, set up a new system
That'll be
the next time
forever.
around.
How did we get approval 11 years ago to go out and do a new list? Had we exhausted it?
Well, the list moves a lot faster as individuals aren't able to qualify. The zeros and one preference points won't most likely be able to qualify, so we'll move through that portion of it. It's usually the 5, 4s, and the 3s that are going to be because of income requirements. If they're not income eligible, then they're not allowed then they're removed from the program. So they can't go back on the waiting list because of that. Those types of things. So you do end up moving through those last portions a lot faster than you do like what you're at right now.
Although we have to do that an applicant at a time as
Yes.
we have vouchers available.
Exactly.
What is the advantage of freezing the list?
We're doing away with the perception of,
Give some certainty.
yeah.
And I'd like to mention that the previous list was open for 11 years. It had 6,000 applications. This one had double the amount of applications, and we're already in year 10.
10, 11.
So we've moved through half of them already.
And it's
So what are
only
you
taken
saying
11
then?
years.
You're saying that the freeze is not a great idea. The freeze may be against HUD regulations.
I just think that from what HUD's explanation to myself is that you're not giving the same equitable chance to the individuals that are currently on the list that the previous individuals that were on the list, the other 6,300 that we took off of that list. They had the opportunity to move up and down within the housing authority or within the waiting list that these individuals will not have. So if 2 individuals that are receiving SSI and one passes away, that person now qualifies for a single elderly and several other preference points, and they move because they're the most needy family.
Ms. Friedman.
Well, yeah, I was going to say something similar, which is I've certainly heard from the community these frustrations and the perceptions. We hear perceptions that the vouchers are being given out unfairly. We also hear people's perceptions that so many people on the system are on it fraudulently. And there's a lot of concern, I think, from a lot of directions. But really, I think what's at issue is less the perception in the community and more who we're trying to help.
Exactly.
And this has been set up to help the neediest people, which is why if all of a sudden you're in a homeless shelter, you're the victim of domestic violence, if you're someone who's particularly at need, you move up on that list. Yes, I'm sure it's extremely frustrating to the people who've been on the list, but our main goal is not to reduce frustration. Our main goal is to give housing to the people who need housing the most. So given that that these criteria do change, we have to be able to give that housing if it's available. I mean, right now it's not even available, but once it becomes available, it's important that we be able to target, given the limited amount of resources we have, the most vulnerable people. And the only way to do that is through this preferential system. And if we freeze, we might be giving housing to people who really don't need it as much as other people.
Mr. Starboard.
Given that you seem to have HUD on your side on that one, it would though maybe offer some hope to the current people on the list if you went through the cleansing process. If you ended up having the firm go through your list, update it, and maybe conclude, okay, you're now not waiting on a list with 4,999 other people, you're waiting on a list with 2,999 other people.
Of course, but those other 2,000 people, or people who fall further down the list, are going to be very upset, and people who move up are going to be very happy.
The cleansing concludes people who likely couldn't be on the list at all, though. It may make your list a lot shorter.
Hopefully.
Could change people's standing. Might induce people who thought they had a higher level to acknowledge that and be in a better position on the list.
I think whether we freeze it or not, there are going to be people who are unhappy, people who are upset, a lot of people who are high up on the list who aren't going to get housing for years, regardless. So, even freezing it there's going to be a lot of people who are unhappy because there are people who realize, maybe somebody who's close to the age where they're going to move up, who are going to say, hey, that's not fair. I've been waiting for years to move up, and now you're telling me that everyone before me got that preference, but I'm not allowed to get it just because of a trick of time. Same with new people coming in. You could have someone who's new coming into we're not taking people on the waiting list, but like I said, someone who suddenly becomes homeless or flees domestic violence, we have to have a way for them to be the priority. And I understand, the freezing would give people more certainty, and I think that is attractive to me as well. But I'm worried about those people who are really the ones that are most at risk that we would not have a way of targeting by doing it that way.
Let me make a proposal, then I'll hear Mr. Mincy. That's been a great discussion, certainly enlightening. I appreciate the presentation. It takes a lot of and I'm going to save this because it takes a lot of the confusion that many of us, speaking for myself, have had over the process. Can we, and this is a motion to note and file, and I will get to Mr. Mincy. I would like to ask staff, if it's supported, to come back with some information on a I don't want to say cleansing, I don't want to say culling, but a review, updating process, as well as perhaps a little more certainty on the unlawfulness of a freezing proposal, and then let's see what costs are, and if it's within our budget, and if we're still interested in taking it a step further at a future date, hopefully not too far in the future.
That's what I was going to say.
Mr. Mincy, I got your brainwaves. Because it'd be good to wrap this up at this point and carry on the conversation, especially when the chair, I don't want to get too far down the road without the chair, because that's certainly something that's been of interest to him as well. And perhaps the community, once they hear where we're going, can give us some input as well as to whether they think it's an equitable way to move forward.
I would concur with Mr. Najarian's request. I don't think we need a motion.
No, it's just direction to staff. It's a motion to note and
There's
file.
a motion to note and file and
No
direction to
objections.
staff.
With no objections,
It's a Housing Authority motion.
the Housing Authority will act unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If point of clarification, Mr. Vice Chair. So the authority is giving direction really on only bullet point number 1.
Yes, we'll
With
hold
regard-
up on the criminal record check, and perhaps something we can that's a component we can discuss when we agree on some parameters on the updating process.
Okay, as well as then same for bullet point number 3.
Why don't we have all three come back when we have our next discussion? If we're looking for ways of...
Right. Let's not foreclose anything,
Yeah.
but bring back. This can be a component of the administrative update procedure.
Of course.
I'm sure it'll be extra charges, for criminal record access and all that.
And a complete different process using different individuals and...
Let's see what that's going to run and see what we would like to do with the chair. Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
I think that's all. There's no new business for the authority. Are there any authority member updates? Mr. Stocking, why don't you run through the agenda?
There's no authority member staff comments or additional comments, and there's no new business.
I move we adjourn.
Second? Okay, authority is adjourned.
Okay, we're going to go next to the joint meeting.